All right, welcome back to the Magnetism podcast, guys and girls. This is episode 8. I'm your host, Tuan, the founder of GlowOps Media, and this is the space where the creator economy, where culture and the psychology of influence all connect and collide together. So, each and every week, I'm going to be riffing off of some of the unseen signals that show up and shape how people show up, from fitness, the culture, fashion, the brand building, because how a brand, how a movement shows up and what makes them magnetic isn't just in the tactics or the strategies or the playbooks. It's in the stories, in the myth, it's in the energy and the presence that they carry with them in every single given moment in time, okay? All right, so I'll open up with a quick little anecdote over the weekend after our Saturday morning run with myself and my boys Jake and Taryn. But this is where this concept really clicked for me, which I'm going to get into in this podcast. All right, so there we were, three of us. We were on Henley Beach, right? It was 30 degrees, actually, so it was a good thing we got the run out of the way early. It was already quite hot, quite humid, right? We ran at a steady, slow pace, a bit of ocean air. There wasn't really a hard, fast distance or a speed we were going for. We just went for a nice, easy 10, 12-kilometer run. This is where it clicked for me, that movement, and this is where culture and a tribe and a movement that what you want to build, it's forged in motion. It's not forged in the incubation tank, sitting in one place in a boardroom, whatever it might be, right? It's forged when you're in motion, right? So there we were just sweat stained after the 10, 12-kilometer run. We were just catching our breath, right? And we were just bouncing off of ideas and just ideating through that we were just ideating concepts and insights which just wouldn't leave us alone. You ever get that feeling, right? When you put yourself in a space, right, in an environment with like-minded people, right, in the same wavelength. This is when the vibrational frequency match and align, that all the ideas just come together and just things just naturally happen. That wouldn't happen if you were to go about things yourself, right? This is one of those moments there. So somewhere between kilometer number 5 and cooling down, right, it just really dawned on me, it really hit me that movements don't start by just opening up a Google Doc or a mission statement or going ChatGPT to help you, right? It just really starts with rhythm, okay? It really starts with that movement there. And it ties back to the fact that you move first and the clarity comes later, right? You don't, actions lead to insights more often than the other way around. And that's when I realized there were two currents that shape everything that we build in life, right? Which is the forge and the flow. And the way I like to conceptualize it is that the forge is like your discipline, is your structure, your repetition. It's the shared bond and connection that comes from collective shared suffering, shared hardship, right? It's the masculine current that hardens you through pressure. And there's the other side of the spectrum, which is the flow, is your expression, your beauty, your magnetism, right? That's the feminine current that turns the effort into something beautiful and art. So the forge builds the body of movement and the flow gives it that soul. And when both currents meet, that's where the culture happens. So when you look at it from the outside, it just look like, it could just be, so I see two ways of looking at this, right? There's no shortage of run clubs throughout all across the country, right? And there's also no shortage of business meetups, entrepreneurial incubators, accelerators, masterminds, etc. Right? By itself, it can just look like just the activity by itself, right? But it really wasn't just a catch up or a running and so forth, right? It wasn't just a meeting; it was a moment there. Because out there, pounding the pavements of Henley Beach, right through to Glenelg on the way back, the ideation starts to breathe and it starts to take on a life of its own. Okay, and so while we're out on the run, there was a very interesting concept that Jake threw out here. So centers along the lines of a discipline-censored marketplace, right? And this is the space where knowledge creators and business owners, entrepreneurs share their blueprints, right? Share their roadmaps, but only a select few earn the right to be inside of that discipline, right? So the discipline and the forge and the embodiment of the forge itself becomes the filter, right? The signal in which to filter it out through. And that's what it sort of means by discipline-censored marketplace. So therefore, it doesn't stay or becomes like a free-for-all, right? It's a forge. And so after the run, what we talked about in our group chats was basically ideating the concept, right? We started building on top of the ideation, a couple of frameworks. And as we were going about the run and as we were just connecting and ideating even after the fact, right? We sort of just started to realize that this is exactly what we've been creating without even realizing it, right? We've sort of eventuated it as a result of just moving forward and being in motion, right? What I really love about the medium of running versus something that we incubated on is that there are a lot of entrepreneurial hybrid athlete clubs and communities, right? The challenge then becomes something that people can get behind, right? So for instance, there'll be some where there'll be a diversity of different sports, but not everybody plays the same. Not everyone plays the sport that they play, right? So what I love about running is running ties it back to a universality, which everybody can get behind. Okay, running also does this beautiful aspect of lowering the ego barrier, right? Something that Wim Hof actually said in regards to ice, which is going to repurpose for the trails of running. He said the ice will expose you, right? The cold will expose you in the same way that the trails, the roads, the mountains that you run and you pound the pavement on, the roads will expose you, okay? And that's where you want to leave your ego outdoor and you leave it. You want to check it, okay? So running has that beautiful universality for everybody where after a certain threshold on a long run, the ego barrier gets lowered, and it gets lowered just enough for the ego, right, to lower so that the ideas can start flowing cleanly. Okay? So the ideas start coming to the surface there, the clean, pure signals. And so what started as a little bit of a habit, right, has started to become the seeds and the foundation for essentially a forge, a founder's forge. It's something which is going to start locally and something which can be incubated to, I think that's a movement, which doesn't have the boundaries. Right? This is where founders, visionaries, just ambitious, passionate individuals, right, movement makers from different worlds and different walks can sharpen each other, right, through the rhythm, through repetition, and through these real and these just genuine, authentic conversations, right? So then you just think that you're just going for a run, but somewhere along kilometer 5, that's where the philosophy starts to form there. And so I want to go a little bit deeper into this concept of the forge and the flow for a second, right? And I want to start off with the forge, okay? So the forge is the masculine current, right? It is that container, it is that structure, right? It can hold heat, it can hold pressure, right? It can withstand, and it embodies discipline to turn chaos into signal, right? And so through the act of rituals, right, for instance, shared sweat, for instance, shared suffering, shared voluntary suffering, right, collectively as a group, in this case here, right, it kills all of the performative, all of the posturing, all of the ego that often keeps us from connecting, firstly, reconnecting to self, but also just reconnecting to everyone around us, right? And this is why founders, entrepreneurs, visionaries here, we just really need these physical anchors and these physical rituals, right? So because they remind us that self-trust first and foremost, but also just trust in its universality, it's earned through rhythm and not just words, right? The forge is not just the forge isn't just a gated community, right? If that's the best way to put it, right? It's a filter. It's a filter energetically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. Right. It's essentially discipline-censored, right? So it's not gatekeeping for any sense of any hierarchical sense, right? So only those who are willing to enter the fire, right? Only those who are willing will feel like they belong there and they feel that they will resonate, right? And it self-selects the people who don't resonate out by default, by a matter of its existence, yeah? And when you look back through history and you look back through tribes, communities, and how these movements have been formed, it shows up in the same patterns over and over and over again. So they say history doesn't often repeat, but it often rhyme. And so when we're talking about wanting to reverse engineer the patterns of history and the patterns of culture, it's a lot of times about seeing what has worked and what has had resonance throughout millennia, and then applying it to the modern context, modern era in which you live in which you embody. So I like to sort of imagine an example, like take for instance the Roman Empire, right? Such a nerdy example just popped into the bit of my head, but you can imagine the thousands of men who were just marching in uniform in synchronicity, just matching the perfect rhythm, pounding the dirt, right, with their shields into position, right, in war. That's what discipline looked like, right? It was that coordination there. So when I think of forge, right, the forge back then was literally heat, right? It was iron sharpens iron, and it's just that repetition, right, of the same synchronized movements towards a singular outcome until the movement becomes instinctual, right? Instinctual to the individual, instinctual to the tribe and to the collective consciousness, right, on the same side in the same movement. So they didn't like sit down and try to force alignment or create alignment through strategies or tactics or whatever, right? It was literally alignment in motion, right? They were moving. Right, they were moving in sync, and as a result of being in that synchronicity, that alignment through momentum appeared. I kind of see it like muscles, right? That founders and entrepreneurs can build today, right? Which is that rhythm under pressure, and just not really needing that applause, if that makes sense. I even look at, say, another example in history, and I do love my history, but centuries later, hundreds of years later, the forge can look like something not quite as loud or abrasive or as ruthless as the Roman Empire, but it can also be something as gentle, as quiet, right? But also just as equally as loud for our silence, right? An example that comes to mind would be a Paris atelier, right? So you can imagine something like a seamstress, right? She might spend 5 or 6 hours over a single stitch, right? And notice there that it's just about the movement there, right? It's the truth that she's chasing through that motion. It's not chasing likes or validations like in the social media age, right? It's basically mining truth through the fabrics, right? When you look at, say, every culture house, right? It has its own forge, right? So you can think of it like a hidden room where repetition, right? Where the refinement comes from the repetition of the movements, right? This is where that patience, that discipline, that embodiment becomes the silent embodiment of that status within that environment and within that existence. Yeah. So inside the walls of that culture, right? The taste is forged in the same way that iron once was, right? It's done slowly, methodically, deliberately, disciplined, and with consequence, right? And with that feedback loop in place. So what you're doing is you're mastering the constraint before you express the art, and that ties back to the forge before the flow, right? And that's why a lot of the great fashion houses existed, and they've lasted decades, right? Because they value the craft over just the minutia of the micro, right, rather than staying, like I said, staying focused on the craft, staying focused on the art, because that's the signal that stands out amongst the chaos and amongst the noise, right? And that same energy runs through my bloodline, right? Through my uncle in Paris, who I'm going to need to share his story actually over the next coming podcast. I think that would give a lot of clarity in terms of my own origin story to share, right? But essentially, it's just a discipline before the beauty, right? And that's where GlowOps actually inherits that structure, right? That structure before before anything else, essentially, right? So one more example I want to tie back to Forge and what that looks like in motion, right? Would be, let's go back to the modern age, right? So fast forward to 2012. Let's look at a garage in the UK, a dark, dim lit garage. You got your teenagers, they're lifting weights, they're on their cracked iPhones. It was just completely bootstrapped, completely raw. There wasn't any particular strategy around influencer strategy. There wasn't even a market for influencers, and influencer marketing didn't even exist back then, right, for it to be the thing. It was just that pure, raw, embodied expression and discipline on camera, right? Just sharing with the world there, right? The world called it content, but really the ones involved, right, in those days, they just called it training, right? This was just early Instagram era, right? This is when YouTube content creation was still a little bit more in the earlier days, right? And a lot of those early Gymshark athletes, they didn't set out their way to chase some kind of validation or culture or some performative act around it, right? They just lived it, they just breathed it, they just became it, those things, right? And so the Forge in this sense became a repetition, right? Repetition through the reps, right? It sells, and that lifestyle then became the marketing, all right? And so that's the modern Forge, right? The craft that you live in and the craft that you execute day in, day out, right? That's disguised as consistency. That in itself, right, becomes the Forge, right? So you can see, doesn't matter the settings might change, right? The time frame, the history might change from the Roman Empire, from the ateliers in Paris to athletes, right? The settings change, but look, the patterns doesn't, right? It's the pressure, right? It's discipline, it's the repetition, and it's the craft, okay? So the Forge is where founders, right, and movement makers and individuals, that's where they build the frame that's sturdy enough, right? Enough for something to last, right? For culture to hang on, okay? But then here's the thing as well: a Forge alone is just heat, right? It just burns, right? It's just fire without art, yeah. And that's where the flow enters, yeah. Just like if you only had the masculine structure in place, right? If you were just in the go do, right, you will be dysregulated. So without the art, all that pressure just hardens you, right? It just hardens into ego, right? If left unchecked in upon itself, right? Which is an interesting part there. That's why every needs its countercurrent, right? It needs that yin, that yang, that balance, right? It needs that flow, right? So the flow is the feminine current, right? That's beauty. That's things like magnetism. That's the storytelling. That's the myth, right? The muse. It's the energy that turns the order into something beautiful, right? Into allure, into mystery, right? Into softness, right? And it turns a lot of the structure into something that magnetizes, right? That just breathes life into everything, right? If the forwards just builds the muscle, then the flow makes it the dance, right? Okay. So if the forwards is a warrior, then the flow makes it the lover there. So you imagine the nature of flow. But think of flow like oxygen, okay? It's what allows you to exhale and to balance out the forwards. So flow is the moment, right? It's the moment where the rhythms you move through becomes art, it becomes music, it becomes cinematic, right? The repetition itself becomes a beautiful dance, becomes ritual, right? And this is where your strategy, your masculine structure, you give it meaning and give it story, right? It's the energy that makes things feel alive again, right? And that's why the same structure that keeps a run club consistent, it's the structure that makes a brand iconic, because rhythm breeds trust, and the trust is what makes that art possible. It's what makes it even possible to dance and to come out and to flow. Yeah. So the magic isn't in the chaos, right? It's in how you refine it. It's in how you channel it. Yeah. So ultimately, flow is feminine intelligence in motion, right? That's sort of like how I like to think about it, conceptualize it, look at it. Where the masculine structure, where the masculine builds, the feminine beautifies. Where the masculine directs is where the feminine amplifies it, right? She doesn't break the structure. She feels it, gives it life, stretches it, gives it warmth. If you look at any great movement out there, right? You take Apple, even even early Gymshark. At some point, they transition from a grind phase, right, in the early days, to one of grace, of one of movement, of one of flow, right? They go from ultimately a paradigm. They ultimately go from look how hard we work, right, to look how effortless this feels, look how effortless it is, yeah? So that's the flow, and that's the invisible aesthetic intelligence that makes all the effort, right, all the effort look like art, look like beauty. Right. This is what I like. This is what GlowOps and the GlowOps universe and GlowOps media exists to embody. Right. So I like to structure and see the vessel and the ecosystem as a living experiment. Okay. It's not just a media house, not just a creative partnerships. It's not just newsletters and a media brand and a directory there. Ultimately, it's a think tank, it's a lab where the discipline gets to meet the desire, and where the masculine structure, masculine precision gets to meet the feminine magnetism and the feminine beauty, right? So every campaign, every creator that we work with, right, say, ultimately, you zoom back into macro, it's a study in polarity, how systems can create freedom, how structure can protect beauty, and how repetition can evolve into rhythm. The masculine discipline and the builder's backbone, right, is the forge, and the feminine expression, the cultural gravity, it's the flow, right? It's essentially the energy that GlowOps essentially looks to capture and to alchemize, right? And so what we do is we stand in the middle, which is the conduit, which is the bridge, right? And it's to be the director of polarity, because that's what the culture really is, right? It's the conversation, it's the dance between the two. The masculine energy builds the vessel, and the feminine energy fills it. And together they create movement. The discipline refines itself into art, into desire. The repetition turns into rhythm, and the frameworks turn themselves into culture. And so the forge, zooming back out, the forge builds the movement, and the flow gives it the soul. And when both can move in the rhythm, that's when the culture really starts to breathe. It becomes a living, breathing, movement there, right? Maybe the real job then, if I'm zooming back out and thinking about it out loud here, is that the real job isn't to quote unquote build a brand, right? It's to create, it's to be able to build and to create the conditions where the forge and the flow can meet. Right? So where the structure protects it allows the space for expression to coexist, and the expression gives the structure meaning, right, through everything that we do, right? So if this episode sparks something in you, share it with someone who moves like this, who's already in rhythm. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or on Apple, then hit follow so you don't miss next week's drop. We drop a new episode every single Monday, because culture doesn't just start with content, it starts with motion. I hope you guys have an amazing rest of the week, and I will talk to you later. Take care.